Hello and welcome to a retro PC tinkering adventure. For quite a while now I'd been gathering the individual components for my retro PC. I experimented a lot and kept replacing parts up until now, when it's finally time to put it all together properly. I'll be taking you with me through the assembly process, and we'll talk about the reasoning behind my hardware choices and share the numerous problems I encountered so far. Hopefully there won't be any more surprises along the way, but we will see. Then we will install DOS and Windows, and as the last step in this video we will have a look at some benchmark values. Not just to see how fast the machine is, but also to find out which configurations it can represent, which is especially important for older games in DOS. In a follow-up video we will then do some time traveling, a journey through games of the 90s to see how well the PC can handle them. These will be quite varied games with a focus on titles that tend to cause issues, either in emulation or on real hardware. Lastly, there will be a conclusion on how well the goal was accomplished and where there's still potential for improvements. And with that, let's talk about the general objective. My goal is to put together a PC that can run as many games from the 90s as possible, with good performance and without glitches. My primary focus lies on the DOS VGA era with pixel art masterpieces such as Lands of Lore, on the early 3D hardware acceleration era, including games like Hexen 2, and finally on the early Windows 98 era, during which the 3D APIs OpenGL and Direct3D were already commonly used, as in games such as Half-Life 1. However, the border of where it makes sense to use such an old PC is somewhat blurry. With a lot of newer games, especially if they're Windows XP compatible, it would be better to approach it from the other side and get much more performance and a higher resolution out of the games. And that's okay, but we will check how far we can go and which newer games still make sense on this machine. And you might be wondering, why not just use emulation? I did some Let's Plays in the past using DOSBox, but it's not like this comes without problems either, and this includes the configurations GOG offers. This means that you either have to plan for some hours of troubleshooting and optimizations, you just accept the issues, or check for optimized settings from other community members and then accept potential quirks they come with. Emulation adds an additional layer of abstraction and potentially even additional sources of errors. In Kingdom or Magic, for example, you get flickering dialogue options if the cycles are set to dynamic. In other games, you might have some sound crackling, or it feels like you're playing with a rubber band when using a not so optimal configuration. Another example for a problem which doesn't occur on real hardware is Hanse die Expedition, where you get a broken frame in between each scene change. The vast majority of issues can be fixed though, and don't get me wrong, original hardware isn't actually less problematic, but you're closer to it, and if you have to spend time on troubleshooting anyways, it just feels much more meaningful to do so with original hardware. That's also because you know that the problem can only be due to hardware or software, and not whatever the emulation is doing. Additionally, playing on original hardware, especially on a CRT, provides a better experience for games which were made for that. Perhaps comparable to the difference between playing a game in full screen or in a window somewhere. It's certainly very subjective, but personally the latter would never immerse me in the same way. And besides software emulation, you also have hardware emulation, which can be done with a Mr. FPGA. Completely pre-assembled units start at about €500, and they can replicate a 486 with up to 90 MHz. While you can't go faster with the Mister, you can of course use it to emulate other devices as well. On top of that, it also got an HDMI connector. Another obvious disadvantage, however, like with software emulation, is that it can't be used natively to read any 5¼ floppies. And so eventually I decided to use original hardware, which however will go along with some modern optimizations. If you are interested in seeing a full list of all the chosen components, you will find that down in the video description. But now, let's get started! The first decision you should make is which platform you want to use, which is of course connected to the selection of board and CPU. To cover the largest possible time span, good options would be slot 1 and alternatively socket 7 or super socket 7. Both feature old ISO slots, important for compatibility with DOS sound cards. They can potentially have an AGP slot for more powerful and 3D capable graphics cards, and they can be equipped with a relatively fast CPU, which can also be slowed down to run older games. There is also the possibility to use faster platforms and then use software to slow them down. That is, if that actually works, which I didn't want to rely upon. And so I decided to use SuperSocket 7. My first plan was actually to use the somewhat more limiting slot 1 board, which I already had, but the issue there was that it doesn't fit physically into the case I want to use, which I will get back to in a bit. Those two platforms are also special in that regard that they come in both AT and ATX standards, and some boards can even use both types of power supplies. With older AT power supplies, the circuit is directly closed and opened by the PC's power switch, making them more dangerous to handle. Some of you may also remember the phrase, "It's now safe to turn off your computer," which comes from the fact that AT power supplies can only be turned off by interrupting the circuit through the power switch. AT also means that the boards do not have an I/O plate for all the connectors like we know them today. The one and only plug which is directly on the board is the one for the AT keyboard. That one, however, can also be used with a PS2 keyboard if you got an adapter. Everything else is handled via additional connectors on the board, which either lead to cutouts in the case or to PCI brackets. And by the way, in this regard, Socket 7 and Slot 1 boards also have another advantage. These platforms can also natively support USB as well as a PS2 mouse, both of which you will often not find on older boards, and adding PS2 mouse support indoors for these retroactively is basically impossible, and you might be limited to just a serial mouse. For using a USB mouse, there is actually an option now with the newly produced ISA sound card called PicoGus, which also offers a USB port which turns the USB signal into a serial one. You can get this card new for 65 euros. But as I mentioned, with the SuperSocket 7 board, this shouldn't be necessary as a lot of them support both of these connectors natively. But this is also where I immediately stumbled upon a problem with my SuperSocket 7 board, the ASCORP 5 ALI 61. While it does support PS2, there was no standard at that point in how it's connected to the bracket. As my board had been shipped without that bracket, I first had to buy a bracket separately and then realign the cables at the connector so that the pins on the board will lead to the right ones at the connector in the bracket. Another problem I encountered during testing was that the system's speed was worse than expected. After some searching, I found that this was due to the ALI chipset being unable to properly handle more than 128 MB of RAM. If more RAM is installed, the overall performance drops by about 20%. This can be reduced to a very small percentage with CPUs that have their own L2 cache, but you need to be aware that games only slowly start to profit from that much RAM around the year 2000. Games which would require a faster CPU anyways. And while the general performance loss would be small, your practical benefit basically doesn't exist. Which is why I decided to stick with just 128 MB. I will talk about two additional problems with the board later on. Troubleshooting this board alone took about 10 to 20 hours already. Let's move on to the CPU, where thanks to the SuperSocket 7 platform quite a few options are available. I purchased the board along with an AMD K6 II CPU with 350 MHz, which I initially replaced with a 500 MHz CPU that you can get for less than 20 euros. Its bus speed can be set to either 66 MHz or 100 MHz, and the multiplier can be set from 2.5 to 5, allowing for a range from 167 to 500 MHz. However, by default this cannot be switched dynamically, as the turbo option for changing clock speeds is no longer supported on Socket 7 boards. I experimented with this and initially found a solution using a 4PDT on-on switch, which basically allows to set and remove CPU jumpers by just flipping the switch. I then designed and soldered together a little board using bistable relays, which now even allows to switch between speeds using the original turbo button. If you're interested in more details, then check out my separate video about this rather specific topic, which you can find linked in the video description and at the end of this video. In the end, I still decided to get the maximum out of this platform, and was lucky to get an AMD K6 II Plus with 570 MHz for less than 70 euros, which oftentimes also costs twice as much. These 2 Plus and 3 Plus models were actually designed for laptops and come with their own L2 cache, which somewhat diffuses the RAM penalties I mentioned before. But as I said, it's not too useful to go for more RAM regardless. Additionally, these K6 II Plus CPUs can usually be overclocked. In my case, this CPU runs on stable 600 MHz without any issues. But the main advantage for a retro PC is that the multiplier can be set directly in the DOS environment, and today you can even lower it down to a multiplier of 2 instead of 2.5. However, you will not be able to adjust the bus speed that way, which is where the little board I soldered together is still useful. When using the PC for DOS, I just press the turbo button, which, thanks to my custom solution, lowers the bus speed down to 60 MHz. In DOS, I then set the multiplier to 2, so that I use DOS with just 120 MHz. In Windows, on the other hand, I will normally just use the full 600 MHz. To cool the CPU, I bought a brand new cooler from StarTech, which can be used in combination with the 60-60mm Noctua fan. More common for this socket are 50-50mm cooling solutions, but unfortunately Noctua doesn't offer any fans for these. As back then the fan speed wasn't actively controlled by the board, I just added two Noctua low noise adapters, which I connected in series to slow down the fan and basically make it inaudible. As the fan got a bigger profile than standard fans, running at full speed is also not necessary to get the job done. As I noticed that there is a cooling unit on the board which gets extremely hot, I mounted an additional small fan on that as well. Probably not necessary, but it also can't hurt, and especially in this case I'm using, every bit of additional airflow is welcome. So much for now regarding the board and the components sitting directly on it. Let's get to the case that the PC will be housed in. This is actually one of the first components I decided on and which I also stuck with. Back in the day, it was sold via Vobis using a label called Highscreen, and it also has been the case of my very first PC, a 386, which I bought used around 1994 and which then replaced my Commodore 64. As it was common back then, this case does have a turbo button and a digital display, which can be set freely with only a few restrictions. Additionally, we got two 5¼ bays and of course also one bay for a 3.5-inch floppy drive. Matching the board, this is an AT case, so that we got the cutouts for the AT keyboard and the serial ports in the back. Since this case is quite compact, it also comes with a few more restrictions. If I wanted to use that slot 1 board, there wouldn't even be enough space for the CPU, as the power supply sits right above it. And even a SuperSocket 7 board can't have the CPU located next to the AGP slot, as the cooler and fan would not fit anymore. This possibly leads to another problem, which I will get to in a bit. Before inserting the board, it's a good idea to connect the cables, as it will be quite challenging to reach the connectors on the board afterwards. These include the IDE connectors for the drives, which are right next to the power connector, which already makes it a mess to handle. I am using an old 200 watts power supply here, where I replaced the original fan with one from Noctua, also using low noise adapters to keep it as quiet as possible. However, be warned that you should not open the power supply if you aren't 100% sure about what you are doing, as there is a real risk of electric shock, which can in theory be deadly. If in doubt, please consult an electrician. The responsibility lies entirely with you. Now let's insert the board while keeping the power supply and the board with the relays outside for now, just to leave some space to work with. As you can see, this quickly turns into something like a surgery, where we need to keep the guts on the side to still be able to reach the other organs. Next up is the graphics card. Of course, it isn't of much use if the CPU is super flexible, but then the graphics card can't cope with all of that. Therefore, it should be a relatively fast card, which also doesn't cause any issues in DOS games. One of my first thoughts was to just use my old GeForce 4 4200 Ti, on which back in the day I had installed a passive aftermarket cooler by Zahlmann. In theory, this card also would have had the advantage of offering an output option via DVI. However, the chipset on my board does have issues with some AGP cards, and among these, cards by Nvidia. To get these running, you first need to use a different graphics card and then use a special software to modify hidden BIOS settings to disable some AGP features. But of course, that also means that you won't be using the full potential of that card. Maybe not that much of a big deal in this case, as the card would already have been overkill. Another card I already had available was a Voodoo 2, which would have been a perfect fit for this PC. There was just one problem. Due to the case, the CPU had to be located behind the PCI slots. But on this specific board, the CPU was sitting behind all 3 of the available PCI slots, and in doing so it was also blocking the Voodoo 2 card. Being quite a long card, the Voodoo 2 would have required that space itself. So I decided to get a Voodoo 3 for the AGP slot, which should be an excellent pick for both old and newer games, and thanks to the Glide API, should be particularly suitable for early 3D games like Lands of Lore 2. While most old graphics cards can be found for less than 50 euros, that's not the case for the Voodoo 3. I was actually quite lucky when I was able to get a Voodoo 3 3000 for just around 100 euros, which is quite cheap already. However, on closer inspection, it even turned out this was actually a Voodoo 3 3500, which is slightly more powerful. I tested this card and quickly encountered some issues. In slower games like Jagged Alliance, pixels would occasionally get stuck, and in games like Duke Nukem 3D I got a horizontal pixel rain. After some back and forth, it turned out that this is a common problem on Voodoo 3 cards, which can be fixed by a setting in the firmware. After I killed the firmware in my first attempt, I actually got it working in my second and was able to apply the new firmware, also thanks to my backup PCI card, which was necessary to actually boot the PC while the temporarily bricked AGP Voodoo 3 was plugged in. As Voodoo 3 cards get quite hot in general but only use a passive cooler, I decided to also add a Noctua fan on this one. There is actually much more I could say about the choice of the graphics card, but as this is quite a big topic in itself, I published a video about that separately. So check out that one if you'd like to know more about connectors, slot types, compatibility issues, and different 3D APIs. We will move ahead and insert the card into the board now. Let's get to the choice of which sound card to use. For maximum compatibility in DOS, it's recommended to use a card in the ISA slot. Personally, I used AdLib and Sound Blaster compatible sound cards back in the day, and I wanted to get exactly that sound again on this machine, which is why I never considered Roland. However, you shouldn't just get the very first Sound Blaster card you find, as they all come with their own issues and the most suitable ones aren't exactly cheap. Therefore, I decided not to purchase an actual original Sound Blaster card, but an ESS Audio Drive ES1868F, a card which is compatible with multiple Sound Blaster models and produces exactly the sound I am looking for. However, most ISA cards have the same general problem. They are very susceptible to power fluctuations on the motherboard. For example, when the CPU is hard at work, this can actually be heard in the background of the sound output. Even more annoying are CD drives causing a pulsating noise on just one side whenever they are loading from a CD. You could avoid the problem by buying a recently produced ISA sound card like the Orpheus 2 LT, which however is no longer available and also had a significant price tag of 210 euros. However, I was able to at least minimize the problem by taking a combination of various steps. For Windows, where the ISA compatibility is not needed, I actually switched to a PCI Sound Card, specifically a Sound Blaster Live. This card is highly compatible within Windows, sounds good, and has no audible noise issues. It is just placed into the mainboard alongside the ISA card and will only be used in Windows. For DOS, the selection of the sound card will be done in the starting menu. To avoid switching sound cables every time, I will connect a short cable to each of the sound cards, leading to a switch. This way I can press a little button to easily switch between the two sources. Putting both outputs of the sound cards together or tunnel them would have meant that you would just have carried any noise issues forward. Using this PCI sound card, a big chunk of problematic situations are already solved. While almost all games in Windows need to load from a CD, in DOS games are often fully installed or they don't even originate from a CD. And without a CD in the drive, there are no noises from the drive either. And it's similar with the CPU. While the CPU is downclocked in DOS, it doesn't generate the audible whine anymore. By having switched to the K6 II Plus CPU, which actually runs on lower volts, this was even reduced further. And of course, this as well isn't an issue in Windows on the PCI card. Next we get to the hard drive, where we have plenty of options. We could use a classical, old and maybe not quite reliable IDE drive, a new SATA drive using an adapter, or we could use a different adapter to turn a compact flash card into a hard drive. I am going to use an IDE to SD card adapter here, simply because new SD cards are quite cheap and freely available. And in addition, it helps with flexibility to have an easily exchangeable hard drive. I will use one SD card for the complete DOS configuration and another one for the Windows one. I initially mounted this adapter to a slot cover and cut a slit into it, allowing me to easily access it from the outside to swap out the SD card, and with it, the entire operating system and the installed games. Of course, this can then also be used to easily put new files on the retro computer or make backups of the whole system. Later on, I mounted the adapter directly behind the cutout, which was intended for the big COM port, which I'm not going to use anyways, and which got just the perfect size. Using this adapter, you just need to be aware of two things. First, you can't switch between master and slave. It's automatically used as master, which is why I am going to connect it to one of the IDE ports and connect the CD drive, which is also set to master, to the other. And the second thing to be aware of is that you need to recreate the master boot record on SD cards to actually make them usable for this. But we will get back to that once we install the systems. Now let's take care of the other drives. First up is the 5¼ floppy drive. I had 3 drives lying around. One seemed a bit suspicious. I tested the other 2 to see which one could read the most disks. The result was that both could read the same amount, so it didn't really matter in the end. When connecting them, you should note that the position on the cable determines which drive will be assigned the letters A and B. The one at the end of the cable will be A, and traditionally that's the smaller drive. So the larger drive goes in the middle and becomes drive D. However, depending on your BIOS, you might be able to swap the letters there. And with that, we get to the small 3½ drive. I also had 2 of these drives available already, which I tested against each other, leading to the same result. They were doing equally well in reading disks. By the way, old disk drives seem to be far more reliable in this regard than modern USB drives. After my first USB drive could barely read any disks anymore, I replaced it with a new one. And while this one is doing much better, it still doesn't work as well as the old drives. The last remaining bay will be used for a CD drive, and finding the right one here took much more effort. Over the years, CD drives have become faster and faster, but with that additional speed, you also got much higher noise levels, making it feel like you were sitting right next to a turbine from an aircraft. Initially, my idea was to simply get an older drive that isn't as fast and therefore not as noisy. So I first bought a quad-speed CD drive from Italy for a total of €51, which then didn't work at all. And then I approached the issue from the opposite direction. I just bought tons of CD drives for extremely cheap, sometimes even for €1 to €2 a piece, and then tested them all. I checked whether they worked at all, how reliably they could read data, how much noise they passed on to the ISA card, and whether you can slow down the drives via some special software. While I didn't find the perfect drive, I did find a couple which I'm quite satisfied with. My choice fell on this Plex writer, a Plextor CD burner, which according to my tests couldn't read absolutely everything when slowed down, but so far in real-world use this hasn't been an issue. I jumped the drive as master and connected it as the only drive to the remaining unused IDE port. Cable management was a foreign concept back in the days in general, but in such a small PC case there is really not much you can do.
Ja, diese Kack-Molex-Stecker.
It's just important that nothing is blocked. Now let's mount the power button, connect the turbo button to the self-made board and mount that one as well. But before we are closing the case, one thing is still missing. A name for the PC. This one will be shown here in this display in the front side of the PC case. Let's close the lid, and born is the Kordanor 2000. Isn't it a beauty? And it even functions. By the way, the display for the clock speed is set to show whether the computer is currently running at a bus speed of 66 or 100 MHz. Of course, the 100 doesn't fit on the display, so it only shows 99. The 66 has been further decreased to 60 later on, which is the lowest clock speed my board can handle. Next up is the installation. The DOS installation is done quickly and without any problems. You just need to be aware that only 8 GB of any hard drive can be addressed, and partitions have a maximum size of 2 GB. The partitions should be split up accordingly. In my case, I'm using a 16 GB SD card, of which only 8 GB are being used, split into 4 partitions. I will address other problems regarding hard drive sizes in a few minutes. For the starting menu and drivers, you can download a starter pack at Phil's Computer Lab. While the ISA sound card by ESS is more compatible in DOS than the PCI sound card, as mentioned, ISA cards usually come with background noise. To increase flexibility, I also added an option to load the PCI card in DOS by editing the boot menu from Phil's Computer Lab. Now I can select between both sound cards at startup. As an alternative to the original driver for the ESS card, I also installed a universal driver called Unisound, which can also be selected when booting in case there are any issues with the original drivers. Additionally, I copied in a software called MIDI-TO, which can be used to lock the mixer of the sound card, which can come in handy with games by Westwood, for example, which otherwise will modify the different volume levels of music and sound effects on their own. However, I didn't add it directly into the AutoExec, and instead you need to launch it manually, or like I did here, just make custom batch files for launching each game and include it there. To reduce the multiplier of the CPU and to disable the cache, I'm using a program called setmul in DOS, which you can also find at Phil's Computer Lab. So while the turbo button is used to reduce the bus speed thanks to the K2 Plus CPU, setmul can be used to reduce the multiplier, which is always jumper to 6 on the board. The command to reduce this multiplier down to just 2 was also added to the AutoExec BUD so that the PC will complete the booting process with the slowest possible clock speed of 120 MHz, which can also be adjusted at any time without needing to restart the PC. If an even lower speed is required, which is mostly being done by disabling the cache, I am also including that into the batch files I create for each game. To slow down the CD drive, I'm using a program called cdbq, which can be downloaded from tools.dosforum.de. You just need to experiment a bit which values lead to which speeds and noisiness on your individual drive. DOS benchmarking and test programs, like the one I used to test the CD drives, can of course also be downloaded from Phil's Computer Lab. By the way, the interface you're seeing here is not Norton Commander, but DOS Navigator. Looks completely the same and also works the same way, but it's legally available for free. The Windows installation is somewhat more complicated, and before starting, the PCI sound card should also be taken out again, so that Windows will only detect the ISA card, which can then be deactivated. Once that is done, the PCI card can be put back in. In the end, that will be the only one which will be used in Windows. But one step at a time. Before doing any installation, I would recommend to check and remove any partitions if your SD card isn't brand new. This can be done on a different PC using a program called Minitool Partition Wizard. Next up, the PC will be booted using the Windows 98 CD and selecting the option to boot with CD drivers. I decided to use Windows 98 2nd edition because all Windows 95 games will work fine as well, and I will potentially profit from some newer drivers. If you go Windows XP or beyond, however, then compatibility issues will show up. Next we run fdisk and confirm that all partitions are indeed cleared, and then create a new partition with a maximum size. Unlike DOS, Windows 98 can actually handle drives with up to 128 GB, which is another advantage over Windows 95, which won't accept more than 32 GB. But to get this SD with 128 GB detected in my BIOS, I needed to perform a BIOS flash, as my old BIOS was also limited to just 32 GB drives. Now the PC needs to be rebooted from CD with selecting CD support again, and we proceed to format the hard drive. However, the format command isn't actually available automatically. The file can be found in the Windows 98 directory of the CD, from where you can also format the hard drive, which in our case is an SD card. The fact that it doesn't show the full size can be ignored, as it's just a display issue. Lastly, it's important for completely fresh SD cards to run the command fdisk/mbr, as otherwise we will not be able to boot from that card. Now we restart the PC yet again, and the installation of Windows 98 SE can begin. While that will take about 15 minutes, there isn't anything noteworthy happening during that time. Once Windows is installed, the driver installation can begin. Ideally, the drivers for the board are installed first, followed by the graphics card driver, so that you actually get a proper picture. But while the colors are fine after the installation, the resolution didn't improve and is at just 640 to 480. We will get back to that in just a minute. As mentioned before, the ISA card should get deactivated before the PCI card is being put back in and finally gets installed properly. It's important to install the VXD drivers, as the WDM drivers can cause compatibility issues. Next up is the installation of DirectX 7. The resolution is still at just 640 to 480 after that, and it also cannot be changed directly using the Voodoo 3 card. However, that can be easily fixed by telling Windows which monitor we are using, which will then also allow us to access the other resolutions. On my 19-inch CRT, I feel like a resolution of 800 by 600 is the perfect compromise of overview and sharpness. At this point, I also want to mention ALI AGP Utilities, a tool for boards with an ALI chipset that can be used to change the AGP settings. I only utilized it for some performance gains, but as mentioned before, it might be necessary to deactivate some features if you want to use NVIDIA cards on the board, as otherwise the PC will just freeze constantly. In Windows, it can also be useful to decrease the CPU speed, and for that I'm using a program called K6 Speed. As mentioned before, the multiplayers jumper to 6, so that on a bus speed of 100 MHz, Windows will always start up with 600 MHz, but you can then slow it down to just 200 MHz. Of course, you can also boot the PC with a bus speed of just 60 MHz and then slow it down to 120 MHz. Lastly, I'm also using a tool in Windows to slow down the speed of the CD drive, which is called CD-Bremse. With this CD slowdown tool, you will also need to experiment a bit to get the right balance between noise and speed. And with that, we've completed the full installation process. Now it's time to take a brief look at benchmark scores, starting with 3D Mark 99. These benchmark scores aren't just about showcasing how great the computer is, but also about testing different configurations and identifying issues. For this machine, 3D Mark 99 closes with a 3D score of 3,279 points and a CPU score of 7,736 points. As comparison, I also ran it with just 500 MHz instead of the full 600 MHz. Of course, it was to be expected that the CPU score would drop, which it did by about 10% in this case. But you can also see how much the 3D score suffers due to that, as it dropped by 10% as well. With the K6 II CPU I used before, and which ran on 500 MHz as well, the 3D performance was even more than 18% below the current maximum performance. So you can see how much the graphics card scales with a faster CPU and its architecture. And you can sense that there might be even more potential that can't be utilized with my current CPU. Another benchmark that can be very helpful is the Final Reality benchmark by Remedy. It tests not only the 2D and 3D performance, but also the bus and AGP speeds. If the frame buffer is disabled, for example, the AGP speed drops from around 3 down to just 1.26. This helps to uncover potential incorrect settings or compatibility issues. In DOS, I did a whole series of benchmarks using programs like 3D Bench and Chris's 3D Benchmark. While in DOS, the maximum values aren't really relevant in my case, as DOS games will not require that much power anyways, I wanted to run these benchmarks to find out the effective range the PC can cover with different configurations, which is important especially for older games that don't run properly on faster PCs. The biggest jump is caused by disabling the L1 cache, and fine adjustments can be made through changing the clock speed. When the PC is slowed down as much as possible, which also includes going into the BIOS to slow down the DRAM timing and gate A20, as well as disabling the VGA frame buffer and the external cache, then the PC basically equals a 386 with 25 MHz. But it's noteworthy that there is a gap between the fastest setting with disabled L1 cache and the slowest setting with active L1 cache. This basically means that the 486 with 66 MHz and a Pentium with 100 MHz can be represented, but nothing in between. However, in practice I haven't encountered any situation where this was relevant. If you're interested in more information about that topic, you can also check out my video about manipulating the clock speed. And of course, now the next question would be how well this machine is going to perform in practice, running various types of games from the 90s. However, we will embark on that journey through time in a second video. I already selected more than 20 games from throughout the 90s, which represent technical developments on the one hand, but will also showcase a whole range of problems on the other. Problems of games being emulated that don't occur on real hardware, and problems on real hardware that oftentimes can be solved, but not always. We will also check up to which point it keeps making sense to use this time machine and when you will get a better experience with a newer machine. And lastly, I will share some thoughts about where it could potentially be improved by selecting different hardware. I hope you enjoyed the adventure this far, and it would be cool if you join again when we take the time machine for a spin through gaming history. Subscribe to the channel and click on the bell to not miss out on that. Once the video is released, you will also find a link to it down in the video description or comment section. And for those of you who can't wait to dive into the past, in a few seconds I will link some videos with a retro touch, as well as the before mentioned videos regarding the graphics cards overview and the alternative to the turbo button. Thanks a lot for watching, and until next time. Alright Doc, can I already go ahead?
No, you must all go to increase the odds that one of you will make it there alive.
Alright then.